Well, hello again. My name is Nalani Brown. I have been reading Mozart's Starling by Leonda Lynn Haupt, a really great book by a Washington local author. We're going to pick up on chapter 5. It's called The Starling of Vienna. When Carmen was young, able to fly, but still fat and gray-feathered, she used to explore our house courageously. She'd fly around every room and like to sit high atop bookshelves or lamps or chandeliers, surveying the scene. Nowadays, she'll come when she's called, or sometimes she will. Anyway, I'll hold out an arm and call her name. Carmen! And though she will ponder for a moment whether or not to do what she's asked, she will most often decide in my favor. Baby Carmen did no such thing. As songbirds feather out, bits of downiness remain here and there among the new feathers, and the last of this to fall away is one little tuft over each eye. A bit of downy fluff sticks out there like an old man's eyebrows, giving the young birds a half adorable, half grumpy look. Carmen, with her brows fluttering, would gaze down at me from the top of some high cupboard when it was time for her to go in for the night. I'd hold up my arm hopelessly. Come on, Carmen. Come on down. She'd just look sweetly about, as young birds do. Finally, I would pull over a stool and risk my life climbing sock-footed onto the counter. When I held my hand close to Carmen, she'd happily hop on. Our house was built in the 1920s. Its most prominent features are wide fir moldings and high, airy ceilings. The floor plan is circular. Kitchen to hall to living room to dining room to mudroom and back to kitchen again, with wide archways between each room. When Carmen was just beginning to fly, I'd help her practice by running in circles around the main floor. She would follow me, flying behind like a little kite. When she or I got tired, we'd take a break and she'd plop on my shoulder for a rest. Then I'd start running again, and she'd leap back into flight. She used to fearlessly follow me everywhere. During my morning shower, she'd flit from the shower curtain rod to the top of my head. When I shampooed my hair, she would gape through my locks to explore the suds. So I put a stop to this practice, worried that she was ingesting soap. Grown-up Carmen does none of these things. Young birds are sweetly naive and open to exploring their world without caution. This is part of why morality is so high in the first months of a bird's life. Adult birds grow wise and more wary, for good reason. The longer Carmen lives with us, the more she settles into a routine. She's comfortable and unafraid in the kitchen, dining room, my study, and of course her aviary. If I wander elsewhere in the house, she becomes visibly nervous and will stick steadfastly to my shoulder. Overall, though, I don't see her as more fearful in life, but more tranquil. I love to see that she has, in her way, made herself at home, made her own home within our larger one, with her own paths and ways and routines and places of comfort. In my mind, Carmen's unfolding story in our household, both physical and oral, mingles constantly with the story of Mozart and Star. I live with not just a wild bird, but Mozart's bird. Every day I pick up my pen and smile, just as Mozart did. At this starling's iridescence, her wildness, her chattering, I transport myself by the power of visualization to the Mozart's home, where Star, like Carmen, would have settled in his own way into their family routine. Even across the distance of time and culture, Mozart's life with Star and mine with Carmen surely share a great deal. Yes, Mozart was a musical genius, but in the bare practical outlines, we are two writers sitting at our desks with starlings on our shoulders. During the very first days that I started to wonder over the story of Mozart and his starling, I began poring over guidebooks to Vienna and Salzburg and treatises on the life and culture of these places. I tried to recreate the streets of Mozart, walked by the rooms where he lived with Star in my mind's eye. I am armed with a tenacious conviction that somehow the presence of the people who live in a home resides in the atmosphere of the walls forever. Although Carmen could teach me a great deal about how anyone, including Mozart, would have lived with such a unique bird, I knew that Mozart's rooms held even more secrets. Like so many Mozart pilgrims before me, I packed my bags for Vienna. First, I would find the perfect Sachertorte. Then I would wander the streets of the city and the halls of Mozart's home. It was September 29th, 1784, when the young Mozart couple moved from their cramped quarters of the Graben to sizable apartments on Domgasse, just around the corner from the great spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral, Vienna's beloved landmark, visible for miles around. In this carriage, Star likely rode in a small cage alongside the Mozart's swaddled son, Carl Thomas, just 9 days old. The weather was fair, and in spite of the trouble of relocating with a newborn, Mozart and Constance were surely in good spirits. Their boy was Rosie, and they were moving to gorgeous third-floor apartments in a desirable neighborhood. Besides, they had to travel only a few blocks, just a 10-minute walk from their previous home, perhaps a few minutes longer in laden carriages. Though the Mozarts moved frequently during their life together in Vienna, 14 apartments in just 10 years, the home at Domgasse is the only residence that still exists. The physical exterior of the Graben apartment building still stands, but the interior has been extensively remodeled as a hotel, so the rooms are nothing like they were during Mozart's life. Anyone seeking to understand this period of Viennese history and culture is indebted to the rare on-the-ground writings of cultural commentator Johann Pezel, who between 1786 and 1790 compiled some of the only extant eyewitness cultural commentary on the place and time. I studied his Vienna sketches obsessively in the weeks before my journey. Petzel reports that the third floor, what Americans would call the second floor, considered the third floor in Vienna, where the basement is counted as floor 1, although the most expensive, was by far the most coveted. Another reason the Mozarts were thrilled with their move. The ground level floor and the one above it were undesirable because of their nearness to dust from the street, the smells of stable and sewers, and the noise of wheeled vehicles passing outside. But once you got above the third floor, rent became cheaper again, since, though the air and the views were finer, it is hard work carrying the necessities of life, wood, water, etc., to those heavenly heights. And while the number of steps brings a reduction in rent, it increased the price to be paid for delivery of goods, carried up 150 steps 10 times a day. Thus, in the top floors of city buildings, in garrets and in attics, nestle the poorest type of tailors, copyists, gilders, music copyists, wood carvers, painters, and so on. Petzel's view is as political as it is colorful. These attic floors are often crawling with hordes of children whose numbers and constant requirements often worry the poor father to the same extent as the rich and distinguished man living on the second floor below has his worries about being able to find a sole heir for his family. In the fresh modern air, it is difficult to imagine the horrific dust in the lives of all Mozart-era Viennese, which Petzel describes as the greatest of plagues. It is the dried-out dust of chalk and gravel. It irritates the eyes and causes all sorts of lung complaints. Servants, runners, hairdressers, coachmen, soldiers, etc., who have to be out on the streets a great deal, often die of pneumonia, consumption, chest infections, etc. The worst situation occurs when, after several warm days, a strong wind springs up. The dust penetrates mouth, nose, and ears, and one's eyes weep. The Mozarts were better situated in these apartments than we realize at first glance from our modern, dustless vantage point. Above the dust, below the labor. I visited Vienna and Salzburg in the autumn, just after the tourist season, when crowds were smaller and prices were a little bit lower. But the weather would be, if all went well, still fine. Fortune smiled. My days in Austria were warm and idyllic. Even today, overlaid with tourist trade, Mozartian chocolates and chocolates, Vienna feels almost enchanted. The musical soul of the city is palpable and true. I like to fancy myself as an easy traveler, open to serendipity of a journey, but on the streets of Vienna, I found myself, as I usually do in such scenarios, clutching my rough guide like Lucy Honeycrutch with her Baedeker. The map within led me to the Mozart's Domgasse apartments, now the Mozart House Museum. Though Wolfgang and Constance loved these rooms where they lived almost for 3 years, they had to leave in 1787 because the rent was just too high. In the decades that followed, there were various leaseholders, and though no one knows exactly when it happened, at some point the rooms were subdivided into 3 smaller living spaces. In 1941, Nazi politicians supervised the acquisition of the lease to one of these smaller apartments and created a modest museum to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Mozart's death for the German Reich's Mozart Week in November that year. Historian Eric Levi, in his book Mozart and the Nazis, How the Third Reich Abused a Cultural Icon, explains that the Nazis were particularly keen to exploit this anniversary, seeing the universal accessibility of Mozart's music as an ideal emotional link between the home and the war front. Ultimately, Levi claims, Mozart was more difficult than many other popular composers for the Nazis to colonize, as his philosophical and moral outlooks, overtly at odds with their agenda, were so well recorded in his many letters. It wasn't until 1976 that the city of Vienna acquired the lease to all of the Domgasse rooms. The original layout was restored and a simple museum was set up. In the mid-1990s, the Wayne Museum organization hoped to attract more visitors by reinvigorating the presentation of Mozart's former residence. The rooms were primed and scrubbed and instilled with a modern curatorial philosophy. Even so, the review in the rough guide was unenthusiastic. I could not wait to see this house and read over the pages dozens of times before my trip searching for a glimmer of hope, but I found none. This is what the rough guide reports. Sadly, despite all the history, the museum is a bit disappointing. A lift whisks you to the 3rd floor, so you have to wade through 2 floors of manuscript facsimiles, and portraits before you reach the apartment itself. Only one of Mozart's rooms actually retains the original decor of marble and stucco, and there are none of Mozart's personal effects and precious little atmosphere. My favorite guide, Rick Steves, did nothing to revive my dwindling hope for this museum pilgrimage, which I had dreamed would be the high point of my Viennese journey. Note that both reviews begin with the same word, sadly. Visiting this museum is like reading a book standing up. Rather than turning pages, you walk room from room. There are almost no real artifacts. Dear me, but I had traveled across the globe to research these very quarters, to see how Wolfgang and Constance made their life in Vienna and how Starr might have fit into it. I lifted my chin and stepped off the narrow cobbled street, prepared to be underwhelmed. Instead, I was transformed. Certainly the entrance is a bit sad. After a promising approach through a marble archway, the place that horse-drawn carriages would have deposited Mozartian visitors, the new reception area evokes a lobby of miniature strip mall Cineplex. The new reception area evokes the lobby of a miniature strip mall Cineplex. There's a flat gray carpet with a coat room lined with cold metal hangers, complete with a stern overseer demanding your wrap and bag, and a discouraging coffee room with IKEA-style chairs and a vending machine. Not an inch of charm in sight. But soon you take the stairs up and up, leaving the modern carpet behind, until you're peering over a rail into the open courtyard and then facing the servant's door into the first room of the Mozart home. The rooms and hallways have indeed been scored, painted, and made safe enough for toddlers of overprotected modern tourists to wander the stairwells without getting their little heads stuck between the iron rails. But the apartments themselves, the rooms in which the family lived their daily round, are otherwise little changed since Mozart's time. The critique of the museum in the Rough and other guidebooks comes, I think, from the reasoning behind its curation. The accepted standard when creating museums around the residences of famous artists and composers has been to do up the rooms in the fashion of the time, to create a memorial to the imagined life of the subject. If the original furniture of the inhabitant is not extant, Mozart's is not, then similar period of furniture or good reproductions are secured and placed in the rooms as the curator surmises they might have been arranged by the famous occupants. This is what we have to come to expect and enjoy. The more progressive curation philosophy at Mozart House revolves around an admission that we don't know for certain what function each room served for the Mozart family. Instead of imposing their own, possibly erroneous vision of an unsuspecting public, the curators take the refreshingly modern approach of inviting visitors to join them in imagining how the rooms might have been used. They speculate in the commentary that is tacked to the walls, but the suggestions are full of accompanying question marks. Question mark by way of invitation. They call it study, bedroom. Instead of certainty, we are offered a moment of creative vision. Here, visitor, you stand in this room, in the rustle of air carrying voices of the past, arise risen to the rafters. You are here. What do you think? In my opinion, this is not at all boring. It is challenging, beautiful, and alive. Wandering the rooms for hours, I felt that my own imagination was carried away in just the right fashion, with an air of possibility that would not have been attainable in a more traditional exhibit. For surely, it is the apartment itself and the whispering ghosts who reside here that are the gem of the museum. And I realized with delight that the curator's approach mirrors the path of the story I'm weaving around Mozart and his Starling. which comes to life in these rooms, but must remain riddled with essential question marks. In each room, there is placed just one period artifact suggestive of life in the apartments. These are all 18th century pieces, similar to Mozart's own, though none of them are original to the household. A table in the probable parlor, a single fork in the kitchen. Meanwhile, an artist has created miniature ivory-colored reproductions of all the furniture known to have belonged to the Mozarts. These live in a model of the house in the first room, the servants' quarters, and we are invited to look inside, to arrange the furniture in our mind's eye. The design of the furniture is mainly Rococo and Baroque, as middle-class families like Mozart's rarely had a house furnished entirely in the neoclassical style of the time. The museum curators offer another playful bit of whimsy on the wall behind the furniture-filled dollhouse. A small shelf displays a set of tiny statues representing the key characters in the household: Constance, Mozart, and Carl Thomas, and a crib holding baby Johann Thomas Leopold, who was born at the apartment in October 1786 and lived just a few weeks. Each figure is formed in yellow or red resin and is about as big as my thumb. To my great surprise and happiness, I found statues not just of the humans of the household, but also of the Mozart's little dog, Gockerl, and a bird in a cage, Mozart's Starling. I leaned over and peered excitedly at the little yellow bird. Admittedly, the statue does not look much like a starling, but who cares? I was thrilled to see that Star was not just my own idiosyncratic obsession, but part of this modern telling of Mozart's story. The professed purpose of the statuettes is to aid us in our imaginative wandering through the apartment. In each room, the figurines of the characters that were likely to have used it are placed in a row on a narrow shelf alongside the curatorial commentary. Thus, Wolfgang and Constance stand in the parlor. The couple and both boys, who likely slept in the same room with their parents, are in the small bedroom. Gockerl is pretty much anywhere, everywhere. And Star? Visions of Carmen's life in my own home swirled through my imagination, as I felt as if this bird figurine leapt from its shelf with a full-size starling and perched on my shoulder. With this unusual guide, I wandered from room to room, asking my question: where did you fly? I started in the servants' quarters, where cleaning supplies, firewood, and the maid's bed were likely kept. The room is narrow but bright. It is unclear where Mozart's manservant, Joseph, would have slept, though he surely lived with the family. It is possible that he unrolled a mattress in the hallway or kitchen at night and rolled it back up during the day. In this he would have fared better than the other servants, and even the family in winter, as his bed would have been nearest the wood stove, the warmest place and the only source of heat in the freezing cold house. This was the Enlightenment, not an episode of Downton Abbey. Even in the richest households, a family's relationship with the servants was more casual than it was in those post-Edwardian times, or in the Victorian era, still 100 years away. The original kitchen was long ago demolished to allow for a central elevator, not for the exhibit, but for the modern residents who inhabit the other apartments. The rest of the building, in fact, still fulfills its original function. Several families live upstairs in the 400-year-old rooms above the exhibits. After you pass through the servant's room, period item, portable wrought iron candlestick. A small dining room, porcelain fruit dish, and what was likely a sort of guest room, simple wooden chair. The apartment opens up into the largest and sunniest space on the floor, probably the salon. The curators have placed a gaming table from Mozart's time in the center of this room. since a full-size billiards table would have been too large, though Mozart loved the game. This is likely the room where parties, dances, and musical performances were held, with chairs rearranged for guests and musicians to suit the occasion. The rooms progress in a kind of L shape, and at the far end of the apartment is a door to a small bedroom with a window that looks out on the cathedral spire. The ceiling is layered with thick, carved, gilded stucco, coils of flowers and fleur-de-lis, and cherubs better suited to an aristocratic mansion than these little mid-class rooms. In the 1720s, the apartment was owned by master stucco artist Albert Kamasina, who worked for the imperial court, and it was he who added this exquisite ceiling. Stucco workers of the Kamasina's caliber were not considered simple builders. They were well respected as skilled artisans. In Mozart's time, the apartment was called Kamasina House. Later, it was known as Figaro House in honor of the famous opera that was composed under its roof. In my imagination, it was this ceiling that sealed Mozart's delight in these lodgings. He could lie on his back and let the music in his mind and the stresses on his nerves melt into the imagery over his head. There he felt calm, bohemian, and a little rich. I had been searching the tiny groupings of statuettes expectantly as I explored each room. But after the suggestions of Starr's existence at the very beginning and the promise that we would see figurines throughout the exhibit, there were no further bird statuettes. I queried the descent, who laughed good-naturedly but did not seem to share my wondering over the bird. Later, I called the Historical Society. Where might the bird's cage have been? No one was willing to venture a guess. Eventually, I came to the final room. Between the parlor and the little bedroom is an expansive study. Surely it was airy, light-filled, with space for a grand piano, violin, viola, and the traipsings of children, servants, students, musicians, dog. This was the perfect working room, and it was here that the ghost bird on my shoulder finally fluffed his shining feathers. In order to give Carmen the most time possible outside her enclosure, I typically bring her up to my writing studio while I work. This takes some preparation. I close the high windows, of course. Then I hide anything that I don't want to be nibbled, poked, stolen, thrashed, tromped on, or pooped upon. If it's winter, I turn off the radiator and cover it with a blanket so Carmen doesn't land on it and burn her delicate little feet. Foot injury or infection is a common cause of death among captive birds, and foot health is something I watch in Carmen carefully, providing her with natural perches of varied width and roughness. Once the room is ready, I place a fresh paper towel within reach to swiftly wipe up pooplets, lock Delilah in Claire's room, then go down to open Carmen's aviary so she can fly to my shoulder and hitch a ride back up the stairs. Since reaching her wary adulthood, she has become suspicious of the stairwell, so I walk down slowly and whisper calming sentiments as we climb. Once inside my studio, she's comfortable. This is her favorite room. So much to do. So many ways to pester me. Carmen will set immediately to her computer work. She loves to ride on my hands while I type, but more than this, she loves to flap, jump, and scamper across the keyboard. She tries to wedge her bill between the keys and the board, another example of the gaping behavior she uses to explore her world. And I worry that one day she will actually pop a key off of her and electrocute herself. It is difficult to believe that her computer play is all chance. She adds letters to documents, amends emails, erases emails, and sends emails before they're finished. She likes Facebook posts. Occasionally, her editing has improved a sentence, deleting one of the the superfluous adverbs to which I am prone. Sometimes I stop to watch the movement of her rainbow-tinted feathers and her smart glistening eyes. After a minute, she turns to look at me, as if to say, "Ahem, more typing, please? How am I supposed to spoil your pitiful attempt to work if you don't even do anything?" Once Carmen tires of the computer, she turns to her second favorite form of studio play, finding something that is dangerous and stealing it. Somehow, she intuits immediately when I want to take away an item that she has made her plaything, and when I reach for it, she will fly tauntingly out of reach. I have learned that when she finds pushpins, thumbtacks, rubber bands, or other things that could kill her if she decides to swallow them, my best strategy is reverse psychology. I affect perfect nonchalance, then pretend interest in a different, shiny little object. Something harmless, perhaps a large, unswallowable paperclip. When Carmen flies over to investigate, I cover it up and tell her she can't have it. This will almost always inspire her to toss away the death thumbtack and try to grab the paperclip. She'll peck at my fingers, wedge her bill between my knuckles to force them apart while squawking angrily, "Come here, come here," until she claims her prize. She always mimics when harried. If I pretend I want the paperclip back, she'll take it away and guard it. To keep Carmen safely occupied, I have made a little toy box for her in my studio, as I did for Claire when she was a toddler. Carmen's is more of a tiny bowl, really. It's filled with her favorite things: paper clips, binder clips, hair ties, sticky notes of various sizes and colors, buttons, a crinkly chocolate wrapper, a peanut in its shell, a tea bag with string and tag. Every day I renew my vain hope that she will occupy herself with these things while I get some writing done. But the issue with Carmen is that she doesn't want to just play with these things. She wants to play with them with me. They must sit on my desk, right at my elbow, where she can choose one and kill it by shaking it back and forth, then thwacking it brutally against the desktop, a behavior she has exhibited since she was very young. She especially likes to attack scraps of paper in this way. I kept this in mind as I studied wild starlings outdoors and saw the behavior duplicated when birds captured insects, especially ones with large wings like dragonflies or moths. The starlings would brandish their bugs and bash them against the ground until their wings were mostly shaken off. Then they would eat the bodies of their now wingless delicacies. Carmen has never had the chance to catch anything with elaborate wings, like a moth or a butterfly, but if a little bug flies near her, I'm shocked at how lightning fast she can catch it and swallow it down. She is always a wild bird. Once Carmen kills all of her toys, she must show them to me one by one, hopping on my shoulder where she can drop a paperclip down my shirt or leave a sticky note in my hair. After an hour or so comes my own favorite Carmen time, finding nothing more to play with, having spent long enough reading books over my shoulder and turning pages that I did not want turned, and having finished all of her email correspondence, Carmen settles onto my shoulder, into the crook of my arm, or on my lap against my belly. She rounds her soft breasts over her feet, fluffs, then unfluffs her feathers, and becomes perfectly still. Sometimes she'll close her eyes. Oftentimes she will simply rest, entirely at peace. She might make a contented little sound, one I never hear from her aviary. It is a sigh chirp, reserved for these moments of quiet snuggling. If I'm still, I can feel her swift heartbeat. I will never tire of such moments. Comfort, rest, and unexpected consolation, shared so easily between two beings who grew from such seemingly different limbs of the taxonomic tree. I envision moments such as these shared between Wolfgang and Star. I'm certain that they are common. It is tempting to assume that in a respectable 18th century home, the bird would sit decoratively in its Rocco-style cage, interacting with the household humans only insofar as it took its flageolet lessons from the perch within. But pet birds of the time were allowed out of their cages and made part of daily life, much more so than modern pet birds. While the typical pet store birds today are not raised by hand, birds from 18th century European bird sellers were generally stolen from their nests as young, alas like Carmen, and raised in a home. They were accustomed to human presence, very tame, knew how to fly around a room without bashing into things, and on the whole made a good family pet. Then, as now, the level of actual social interaction varied with the species of bird. Finches and canaries are tameable, diverting, and sing prettily, but will always be a bit skittish. Species with higher plasticity of behavior, birds like parrots, starlings, and mynas, the mimics notably, are capable of much more. As far as we know, Star was the first bird Mozart brought into his married household, and he'd lived with many animals throughout his life. A field guide to Mozart family animals would include his childhood dog, Bimperl, several canaries, and the old horse he brought from Salzburg to Vienna, whom he lovingly called the Kelper, or Nag. The Mozarts responded to their pets with a lively affection. When traveling in Europe, young Mozart would send newsy letters home that culminated with messages for the spaniel. Cover Bimperl in 1,000 million kisses, and pull her fluffy tail for me 100 times, and fluff her until she barks. Star and Gockerl, like other pets of the era, were at the center of the sea change regarding human attitudes towards non-human creatures. It remained a predominant belief throughout the 18th century that all organisms were created by God for human pleasure or edification. Birds sing for our delight. Cows dot the landscape to inspire feelings of serenity, and of course, to feed us. Even seemingly insidious creatures demonstrate divine wisdom and the love of God for man. Weeds exist to encourage human industry and the movement of our bodies for health. Lice incite us to keep clean. Before the 18th century, human relationships with animals were largely utilitarian: food, transport, work, and scientific research. While the aristocracy might have kept exotic pets, the bourgeoisie in general did not. With René Descartes at the helm of a fashionable rationalist philosophy, only humans were imbued with consciousness. Animals were mindless automatons, incapable of either thought or suffering. Their cries during scientific study or slaughter were likened by the Descartes to the squeaking of a door on its hinges, and nothing more. The philosophy of Descartes had become ingrained in the emerging sciences, particularly medicine, where it was used to justify horrific surgical research on live animals. It was partly in response to Descartes that Rousseau published his Social Contract in 1762, just 12 years before Mozart brought Star home. Rousseau was born a Calvinist and earnestly converted to Catholicism as a young man, yet he came to believe that the highest insight into religious truth was not revealed but natural, found in the pageantry and harmony of nurture. Animals become not just workers in the field of God, but windows into the character and workings of God. Rousseau wandered the countryside for peace of mind and heart, and there, amid the simple quietness of plants and movements of birds, he experienced a unity of all things. That anticipated the modern ecology movement. His work on animals is an outright rejection of Descartes. Animals may or may not be rational, but they are clearly sentient. They can suffer and so deserve to be treated kindly by humans. Rousseau led the philosophical groundwork for a continuum between human and animal consciousness in the social contract writing. Every animal has ideas, since it has senses. It even combines those ideas in a certain degree, and it is only in degree that man differs, in this respect, from the brute. It was the Rousseauian view of nature that largely inspired the culture of human-animal interaction in Mozart's time. When it became increasingly popular to keep its pets in upper and middle-class homes, dogs and birds in particular, Mausers, cats were considered working animals and most often kept by the lowering and farming classes. Pets were, more than ever before, brought into the house and round of daily life, and it is this directed daily contact with animals by ordinary people that undermined Descartes more than any academic or lofty moral argument. People living with pets could see very clearly that these animals possess consciousness worthy of human consideration. The pet keeping of this period is often interpreted as being merely decorative. But Mozart and his Starling were actually part of a great philosophical bridge leading from a disastrous lack of ethical standing for animals to the strong evolutionary case for animal consciousness in the 19th century work of Charles Darwin and George Romanes, who in specific language poised a continuity between humans and animals, both in body and mind. Their work, along with Rousseau's social contract, led to a movement for the humane treatment of animals, and eventually the original humane society. Still, it would be a mistake to confuse this common sense recognition of animal consciousness with modern ecological view of wild animals in nature. Rousseau was an Enlightenment thinker, but romantic in nature. Rousseau was romantic to the core. For the public, the Rousseauan vision for nature's goodness, order, and harmony trickled down into the idealized, tamed, golden-like sensibility. Their pet keeping reflected this. Like the effort to make native bird songs conform to a more human sense of proper musical structure, elaborate cages were patterned after the current taste in architecture. The finer cages were often crafted of mahogany, with silver or brass fittings and lots of tiny alcoves and turrets too small for a bird to enter. They were difficult to clean, decorated with toxic paint, and riddled with exposed nails, created more for ornament than for the health of birds. Tiny, portable cages that allowed singing birds to be carried from room to room were popular, an idyllic 18th century vision of the modern boombox. I doubt the Mozarts had one of these, as there was plenty of music in the house already. Much of what we know about 18th century bird keeping centers on a study of portraiture. Professionally commissioned portraits from this period regularly show women and children with pet birds out of their cages. Birds are perched on the shoulders of their keepers, sitting on their fingers, playing with the ribbons on their costumes, eating bits of food from their hands or from the end of a preferred stick, like the Starbucks stirring sticks I used to raise Carmen. All these behaviors imply hours of daily freedom. Birds that are primarily caged do not remain tame or tractable enough to interact with their keepers so gently and intimately. Any bird, even when it is raised by hand, will become wary of people when left alone in a cage. In Meredith West's modern study, the hand-raised birds that were kept on the porch rather than in the house lost their tameness among humans. But in these portraits, we see a teenage girl and colorful finch perched on the same chair, looking at each other with ease and familiarity. A child and a dove each holding one end of a red silk streamer. A woman in a parlor, playing her tabletop piano for a chaffinch who stands gazing upon the tote of her silk slipper. The woman herself looks aloof, bored, desperate for any kind of diversion, as so many intelligent upper-class women were. For such paintings, all humans appear in their finery. Little boys are scrubbed as shining. Girls are skirted by froths of billowing pale silk. Men do not typically appear in portraits with birds unless it is a family portrait and the bird is among the children. Societally and artistically, the bird represents a sense of innocent pleasure. Hence, it belongs in the realm of children and young women. The portraits convey the atmosphere of a pre-fall Eden, a proper garden of wonders for the young. Mozart, of course, was a man, but just because men are not seen engaging with birds in portraits does not mean that they did not do so in the privacy of their households. And Mozart, we know, was a bird of a different feather. There is a reason that I have not been able to find a portrait that includes a starling from this period. Pet birds and family portraits were both symbols of social rank. Exotic parents and finely trained canaries were expensive and indicative of a certain status. Starlings were common, native birds that any peasant could pluck from a nest. In a shop, they cost just a few kreuzer, so were unfit for portraiture. It says a great deal that the status-conscious Mozart chose a starling for his pet. It means that he didn't just want a bird, he wanted this bird. Where does all of this put Star in the Mozart house? For Mozart, there could only be one answer: where the music was, where Star could be watched, twitted to, flirted with, where he could join the music, pester the maestro, pluck at the violin strings, and pull at the quill pen, tip the ink bottle. The Mozarts always made their own music, their own bohemian life. The elegy that the Mozart composed for Star when he died shows such a keen understanding of the starling personality, such a personal knowing of this bird, that the two must have shared each other's company day to day. He was not naughty, quite, but gay and bright. The little yellow statue of Star in the Mozart house should go in the study. Did Star venture beyond the study? It is unlikely. Surely the servants had no time for such nonsense. In the parlor, Star might poop on the fine felt surface of the gaming table or upset the whist game by stealing a card. Guests in the parlor would not have appreciated starling poo in their freshly friseured tresses any more than my modern guests do in their hair. If Carmen is out of her aviary when friends are around, we offer poop shirts. Some old things of ours that Carmen can poop on, so no one's outfit gets mused. Besides, starlings get attached to a familiar place. Like Carmen with her aviary and its environs, Star was probably happy staying close to Mozart's cheerful study. I can hardly breathe when I ponder Mozart's daily schedule and workload. His output was almost inconceivable. In 1784, the year he and Constance moved to Camsina House, he wrote 6 piano concertos, 1 piano quintet, 1 string quartet, 2 piano sonatas, 2 sets of variations for piano, and dozens of shorter compositions. In 1785, he composed 3 piano concertos, 2 string quartets, 1 piano quartet, a sonata, and the Fantasia in C minor for piano, the Maurice Trauermusik, Masonic funeral music. operatic scenes for vocal trio and quartet, and several gorgeous parlor songs, and arranged the Mass in C minor as part of a cantata. We imagine him, like most writers, painters, and other artists, working in undisturbed peace and seclusion, with his dutiful spouse shushing the babes and guarding her genius husband's privacy. In the Mozart household, nothing could have been further from the truth. Constance was a beloved partner to Wolfgang, but, as Volkmar Braunbins writes in his brilliant biography in Mozart in Vienna, 1781 to 1791, she was not a good little housewife who spent the whole day doing laundry, cooking, and keeping the children away from her husband so he could have the peace to work. The Mozart house was a loud and restless one, but least of all because of the children, who played a minor role. It had more to do with music, pupils, house concerts, and rehearsals, and with Mozart's own need for constant commotion, conversation, laughter, visitors who were often house guests. We know that Mozart's house was full of music. He was running about Vienna, yes, but he was also at home for hours each day, composing, playing, teaching. It is said that when thinking, he spoke aloud to himself in operatic recitative. Constance had a splendid voice and sang as she knit lace, sewed, or chased and dandled the children. In the summer of 1788, Constance's brother-in-law, Joseph Lang, who had married Aloysia, Constance's older sister and the object of Mozart's early romantic passion, brought a gaggle of theater folk, including 2 Danish actors, to visit the Mozarts. We have this wonderful diary entry from one of the Danes, a slice of the Mozart home. There, I had the happiest hour of music that has ever fallen my lot. This small man and great master twice extemporized on a pedal pianoforte so wonderfully, that I quite lost myself. He intertwined the most difficult passages with the most lovely themes. His wife cut quill pens for the copyist. A pupil composed. A little boy aged 4 walked about in the garden and sang recitatives. In short, everything that surrounded this splendid man was musical. The diarist was an enamored guest, and Wolfgang surely took a moment to show off, but nearly all reports of daily life at the Mozart compound are similar: musical and domestic chaos, and the composer happy within it. There were the children, upon whom Wolfgang doted, and the dog, and the students. Mozart taught female students in their own homes, but they were chaperoned, as was customary. But male students came to his studio, and particularly gifted young men would stay for months, perhaps a year, and live as part of the household, treated as family. Mozart not only managed to compose amid all this chaos, by all reports, he preferred it. The background noise and bustle was something to work against. It is said that when Wolfgang was composing music in his mind, his outward actions changed little, but something about his countenance became for a moment a touch distant, as if he were listening to a faraway bird song. Before his quill sped along again, Star would not have been a distraction at all, at least not an unwelcome one, but a rather strand in the splendid, essential, and most divine chaos. Leopold made just one extraordinary visit to Wolfgang and Constance after they were married. He arrived in March of 1785 for a 10-week stay, prepared to be appalled at the state of the household and marriage. Instead, he was impressed with Constance's economy and enthralled with the liveliness of the home. He wrote to Nannerl, whom he had left alone in Salzburg. "It is impossible to describe the rush and bustle. Since my arrival, your brother's piano has been taking at least a dozen times to the theater or to some other house. This happened constantly. A fuzzy maestro preferred his own instrument for performances, and so it was moved every 2 or 3 days. Earlier that year, Mozart had composed a set of quartets for his friend and mentor Joseph Haydn, and was anxious for the maestro's opinion before he ventured to formally dedicate them. During Leopold Mozart's stay in the Domgasse apartment, the quartets were performed at a small party for Haydn, with Wolfgang playing viola and Leopold Mozart himself playing first violin. After Haydn famously commented to Leopold, "I swear to you before God and as an honest man that your son is the greatest composer I have ever known in person or by name." And in a jarring departure from the rest of the Mozart House's museum's simplicity, these words are painted in slender, period, calligraphic style on the salon wall. In my imagination, Leopold's narrow face is almost permanently lined with an anxious semi-scowl, his dark version of the Mona Lisa's smile. Still, the pleasure he felt at this compliment could not have been hidden. The night was a glorious one for Mozart. Haydn loved the quartets. His father was proud. The parlor was filled with glowing candles and the swooshing whisper of brocade. During my visit, I walked to the windows of this open, sunny room, which overlooked a narrow, cobbled pedestrian alley, sweet buildings, and my favorite little cafe away from the busyness of the Graben, surrounded by pink autumn petunias. I closed my eyes and heard the music. If my suspicions are correct, there was another layer to the musical offerings that night, beyond the usual quartet instrumentation. Mozart's study and, if I am right, Starr's cage were just one room away. An acclaimed neuropsychologist wrote that only humans have a natural or innate inclination to engage with music. I read this aloud one evening at the dinner table, and everyone cracked up. Clearly, the scientist has never lived with a Starling. When live music is played in our house, Carmen is constitutionally incapable of silence. She jumps and flutters and then settles into singing with full Starling exuberance. Whistled cadenzas, warbles. "Hi, Carmen." "Hi, honey." Wine stopper sounds, more whistles, wildness, joyfulness. There is plenty of opportunity. Claire is a gifted musician, playing for hours a day on her cello, but also on piano, mandolin, and guitar. I play the Celtic harp and a little violin and piano. Tom plays the cowbell. Usually, we just revel in Carmen's participation, hearing it as an element of the music, par for the course in our slightly eccentric household of writers and players. But it can be a nuisance when Claire is trying to make a cello recording for an audition or give a serious home performance. Sometimes I'll take Carmen up to my study when Claire needs to make a clean recording. But once we attached a note to a recorded audition for a prestigious festival. Claire had played perfectly and nearly cried when she heard the overlay of "Hi, Carmen, kiss me" on top of her Tchaikovsky. Please excuse the bird sounds. We have a pet starling. Mozart had one too. It's not just Carmen. This is what starlings do. They join the music. What happened in the night that Haydn's quartets were performed? Did the Mozarts toss a blanket over Starr's cage to discourage loud whistles and warbles that the music surely incited? Did they close the door to dampen Starr's song? Certainly not. Leopold loved birds at least as much as his son did. I would bet 100 gulden that they all laughed, opened wide the doors between the rooms, and enjoyed another strain of the household orchestra. That was the end of chapter 5 of Mozart's Starling by Leonda Lynn Haupt. My name is Nalani Brown. I'm the philanthropy coordinator at Frank Toby Jones, reading at the Point Defiance Ruston Senior Center. We'll pick up on chapter 6 next time. It's called How the Starling Knew. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed.